In a shocking display of defiance that stunned the small town of Thornhaven Moor, a grief-stricken husband violently tears apart a sacred Bible during Sunday Mass, unleashing a series of inexplicable events that will forever change the lives of everyone present. What follows next leaves the entire congregation questioning everything they believe about faith, forgiveness, and the thin line between divine intervention and madness. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale that will challenge your beliefs and touch your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of redemption, faith, and the mysterious ways life can transform in an instant. Hit that notification bell. The ancient bells of St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral tolled ominously through the misty morning air of Thornhaven Moor, their deep resonance carrying across the cobblestone streets like a mournful dirge. Callum Thorne stood at the edge of Moonwhisper River, his weathered hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had turned white. The sound of those bells, once a source of comfort, now felt like daggers piercing his already shattered heart. 7 days had passed since he had buried Seren, his beloved wife of 15 years. 7 days of emptiness, of unanswered prayers, of watching the sun rise and set with mechanical indifference to his suffering. The funeral replayed in his mind like a twisted film reel, Father Ambrose Nightshade's hollow words of comfort, the pitying glances from townspeople who had known them both since childhood, the way the autumn leaves had fallen on Serene's casket like nature's own farewell tears. 3 months, Callum whispered to the flowing river, his voice rough with unshed tears. 3 months of praying every single day, of lighting candles, of making promises, of begging for a miracle. He laughed bitterly, the sound harsh against the morning quiet. And what did faith give me? Nothing but silence. The cathedral bells rang again, calling the faithful to Sunday Mass. Each toll seemed to mock him now, each ring a reminder of his unanswered prayers during Serene's illness. Dr. Cassius Flynn had done everything possible, working tirelessly to save her, but in the end even modern medicine had failed, and God, the God Callum had devoted his entire life to, had remained silent. Something snapped inside Callum as the final bell tolled. Without conscious thought, his feet began moving, carrying him away from the river and toward St. Chrysanthemum's. The massive Gothic structure loomed before him, its stained glass windows glowing in the early morning light like jewels in a crown. How many times had he and Seren sat beneath those windows, hands clasped in prayer, hearts full of hope? As he approached the cathedral steps, he caught sight of Vesper Vale arranging flowers by the entrance. She had been Seren's closest friend, and now she looked at Callum with eyes full of concern. "Callum," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "I've been worried about you. We all have." But Callum brushed past her, his mind focused on one thing only. The massive oak doors groaned as he pushed them open, the sound echoing through the vaulted ceiling like a warning. Inside, the air was heavy with incense, and the pews were already filling with the Sunday congregation. Father Ambrose stood at the altar adjusting his vestments while Ash Winters, the young church assistant, arranged the sacred texts for the service. Father Ambrose looked up at the sound of Callum's heavy footsteps on the stone floor. The priest's eyes widened slightly. He had known Callum since he was a boy, had watched him grow into a man of deep faith, had counseled him through difficult times. But the person standing in the cathedral now was someone different, someone dangerous. There was a darkness in Callum's eyes that made the priest's blood run cold. "My son," Father Ambrose began, his voice gentle but wary. "I've been hoping you would return to us." Callum didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the ornate Bible displayed on the altar, its gold-leafed pages catching the light from the stained glass windows. Without warning, he surged forward, pushing past a startled Ash Winters and grabbing the sacred book in his trembling hands. "Callum, please." Father Ambrose stepped forward, reaching out. "Whatever you're thinking." "Thinking?" Callum's voice cracked like thunder in the hushed cathedral. "I've done nothing but think, Father. Think and pray and beg. And what has it gotten me? Where was God when Seren was suffering? Where was he when she took her last breath?" A murmur of distress rippled through the congregation. Elderly Dorothea Blackthorne began to pray audibly from her usual spot in the front pew, her rosary beads clicking frantically between her gnarled fingers. Sylvan Reed, the local shopkeeper, stood up as if to intervene, but something in Callum's posture made him hesitate. And then, in one violent motion that seemed to tear through the very fabric of that holy morning, Callum ripped the Bible in half. The sound of ancient pages ripping filled the cathedral like a scream, followed by a collective gasp from the congregation. Gold-leafed pages fluttered to the ground like wounded birds, scattering across the polished stone floor. "There," Callum said, his voice breaking. "There's your faith. There's your God." But as the last page settled on the floor, something strange began to happen. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows started to pulse almost like a heartbeat. A wind that had no source whispered through the cathedral, though all the doors and windows were closed. And in that moment, as Callum stood among the scattered pages of the destroyed Bible, surrounded by the horror of his actions, the air itself seemed to thicken with a presence that was both terrifying and magnificent. No one in St. Chrysanthemum's cathedral that morning could have predicted what would happen next, or how this act of desperate rebellion would set in motion events that would shake their small town to its very foundations. For in challenging God so directly, Callum Thorne had opened a door that could not easily be closed, and through that door would come things that would test not just his own faith, but the faith of every soul in Thornhaven Moor. Father Ambrose crossed himself slowly, his eyes never leaving Callum's face. "May God have mercy on us all," he whispered, as the strange light continued to pulse through the stained glass, casting shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. The scattered pages of the torn Bible lay motionless on the cathedral floor, yet the air around them seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. Callum Thorne stood amid the destruction he had created, his chest heaving, as the strange pulsing light from the stained glass windows cast shifting patterns across his face. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening, broken only by Dorothea Blackthorne's quiet prayers and the subtle whisper of that inexplicable wind. Father Ambrose Nightshade moved slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a wounded animal. His weathered face reflected not anger, but a deep, profound sadness. "Callum," he said softly, "what you've done here today—" "Save your sermons, Father." Callum cut him off, his voice raw. "I've heard enough of them to last a lifetime." But even as the words left his mouth, something changed in his expression. The initial rush of his defiant act was fading, replaced by something else. Not quite regret, but a dawning awareness of the weight of what he had done. From her position near the altar, Vesper Vale watched the scene unfold with tears streaming down her face. She had known both Callum and Serene since they were all children, had watched their love bloom in this very cathedral. Now, seeing Callum standing there, surrounded by the torn pages of the sacred text, she felt her heart breaking all over again. "Everyone, please," Father Ambrose addressed the stunned congregation, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I ask that you leave us now, go in peace, and pray for our brother Callum." The congregation began to file out, their movements hesitant, their whispers creating a low hum of concern and speculation. Some, like Sylvan Reed, cast worried glances back at Callum, while others hurried past with their heads down, as if afraid to meet his gaze. Dr. Cassius Flynn, who had treated Saran in her final days, paused at the door, his professional composure cracking slightly as he watched his former patient's husband standing amid the destruction. But not everyone left. Vesper remained, moving closer to where Father Ambrose stood, and Ash Winters lingered near the altar, his young face a mixture of fear and fascination. The strange light continued to pulse through the windows, creating an almost hypnotic atmosphere in the now empty cathedral. "Do you feel better now, Callum?" Father Ambrose asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Has this act of destruction eased your pain?" Callum looked down at his hands, which still trembled slightly. "I don't know what I feel anymore, Father," he admitted. And for the first time since Seren's death, his voice carried something other than anger, a hint of confusion, of vulnerability. Just then, a strange sound filled the cathedral, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. The remaining pages of the torn Bible rustled on the floor, though the mysterious wind had ceased. Ash Winters took a step back, crossing himself repeatedly. "Father," he whispered. "The windows." The stained glass windows, ancient masterpieces that had adorned St. Chrysanthemums for generations, were beginning to change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The figures depicted in them, saints, angels, and holy scenes, appeared to shift and move, their colors intensifying until they seemed to burn with an inner fire. Vesper moved closer to Callum, despite her fear. "We should leave," she said urgently, reaching for his arm. "Something's not right here." But Callum stood transfixed, watching as the light from the windows began to coalesce, forming patterns on the cathedral floor that seemed almost like writing. Ancient symbols that appeared and disappeared too quickly to read. The air grew thick with an electric tension that made everyone's hair stand on end. Father Ambrose stepped forward, placing himself between Callum and the strange phenomena. "Whatever is happening here," he said firmly, "it's not too late to seek forgiveness, my son." Callum laughed, but the sound held no mirth. "Forgiveness? For what, Father? For demanding answers? For questioning why a supposedly loving God would take away the one person who made my life worth living?" As if in response to his words, the humming grew louder, and the temperature in the cathedral dropped dramatically. Frost began to form on the stone floors, creeping outward from where the torn Bible lay scattered. Ash Winters let out a startled gasp as his breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. "This isn't natural," Vesper whispered, her voice shaking. "Callum, please, let's go." But before anyone could move, the largest window at the front of the cathedral, a magnificent piece depicting the Ascension, blazed with a light so intense it was almost blinding. In that moment, every candle in the cathedral extinguished simultaneously, plunging the space into an eerie twilight broken only by the otherworldly glow from the windows. Father Ambrose began to pray, his Latin words echoing through the space with a power that seemed to push back against the strange phenomena. Yet even as he prayed, the symbols on the floor grew more distinct, forming patterns that spiraled out from the torn Bible like ripples in a pond. Callum felt something then, a presence, vast and indefinable, that seemed to fill the entire cathedral. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it carried a weight of judgment that made his knees weak. For the first time since his act of defiance, real fear began to creep into his heart. "What's happening?" he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The anger that had driven him to tear the Bible was being replaced by a growing sense of awe and terror. Vesper's hand found his in the semi-darkness, her grip firm despite her obvious fear. "Whatever this is," she said softly, "you're not facing it alone." Father Ambrose's prayers grew stronger, and as they did, the chaos around them seemed to stabilize. The wild fluctuations of light settled into a steady, pulsing glow, and the mysterious symbols on the floor became fixed, no longer shifting and changing. "Callum," Father Ambrose said, turning to face him, "I believe your actions have awakened something in this sacred space, something that has been dormant for a very long time. The question now is, are you prepared to face the consequences of what you've done?" As if to emphasize his words, a deep bell tone reverberated through the cathedral, though the bells themselves remained motionless in their tower. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the space with its resonance until it felt like the very air was vibrating with its power. Callum looked at the faces around him, Father Ambrose's steady gaze, Vesper's concerned expression, Ash's wide-eyed fear, and realized that his act of rebellion had set in motion events that none of them could have anticipated. Whatever was happening in St. Chrysanthemum's cathedral, whatever force his destruction of the Bible had awakened, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The frost continued to spread across the floor, and in its intricate patterns, Callum could almost make out faces, or were they memories, flickering and fading like dreams on the edge of waking. And somewhere, in the depths of his grief-stricken heart, a small voice whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, he had finally gotten the response he had been seeking all along. though not in any way he could have expected. The news of what had transpired at St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral spread through Thornhaven Moor like wildfire. By nightfall, the small town was alive with whispered conversations and wild speculations. Groups gathered at the Wayfarers' Market, where Sylvan Reed found himself retelling the morning's events for the 12th time to wide-eyed listeners. Meanwhile, Callum Thorne sat alone in his darkened house on the outskirts of town, the events of the morning replaying in his mind like a fever dream. The torn pages of the Bible, the strange lights, the inexplicable frost. It all seemed both terrifyingly real and impossibly distant. His hands still trembled slightly, though whether from the lingering cold of the cathedral or from the weight of what he'd done, he couldn't say. A soft knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. He considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. When he opened the door, he found Vesper Vale standing there, holding a covered dish and wearing an expression of determined compassion. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," she said simply, pushing past him into the house. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the air as she set the dish down on his kitchen table. Not after what happened this morning. Callum watched her move about his kitchen with familiar ease, lighting lamps and pulling plates from cupboards as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "The whole town must think I've gone mad," he said finally, his voice rough from hours of silence. Vesper paused in her movements, turning to face him. "The town thinks a lot of things right now, Callum. Most of them don't know what to believe. Father Ambrose has been in meetings with the church elders all afternoon, and Thalia Whitmore swears she saw angels in the frost patterns on the cathedral floor." "And what do you think?" Callum asked, studying her face in the lamplight. "I think," she said carefully, "that something extraordinary happened today. Something that can't be explained away by grief or anger alone." She hesitated, then added, "Doctor, Flynn stopped by my house earlier. He's worried about you. We all are." Before Callum could respond, a strange sound caught their attention, a low, melodic humming that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. The lamps flickered, their flames dancing wildly for a moment before settling back to normal. Both Callum and Vesper stood frozen, watching as frost patterns similar to those in the cathedral began to form on the windows, despite the mild autumn evening outside. "It's following me," Callum whispered, a note of fear creeping into his voice. "Whatever it is, whatever I awakened, it's followed me home." Vesper moved closer to him, her hand finding his arm. "Then we face it together," she said firmly. "You're not alone in this, Callum. You never were." The humming grew louder, and with it came a sensation of presence, the same vast, indefinable feeling that had filled the cathedral that morning. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, their breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. On the kitchen table, the dishes began to rattle softly, as if responding to some unseen vibration. "We should call Father Ambrose," Vesper suggested, but even as she spoke, there was a knock at the door. When Callum opened it, the priest stood there, his face grave in the gathering darkness. "I felt it," Father Ambrose said simply, stepping inside. "The presence. It's grown stronger since this morning." He looked around the room, taking in the frost patterns on the windows and the still vibrating dishes. "This is unlike anything I've encountered in all my years of service." As if in response to his words, the humming changed pitch, becoming deeper, more resonant. The frost patterns on the windows began to move and shift, forming images that appeared and disappeared too quickly to fully comprehend. But one pattern remained constant, a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward, creating an almost hypnotic effect. "Look," Vesper breathed, pointing to the spiral. "There's something in it. Faces, I think." Callum stepped closer to the window, his heart pounding. In the intricate patterns of the frost, he could see flickering images, moments from his life with Seren, but viewed from strange angles, as if seen through someone else's eyes. There she was, laughing in the summer sun. There they were, dancing at their wedding. There she lay in her final days, her face peaceful despite the pain. "It's showing me memories," he said, his voice breaking. "But they're different somehow." Changed. Father Ambrose moved to stand beside him, studying the patterns intently. Not changed, he said softly. Illuminated. We're seeing these moments as they truly were, touched by divine presence, though we were too blind to see it at the time. The humming grew more intense, and the images in the frost began to move faster, showing not just memories, but moments Callum had never seen. Seren praying alone in the cathedral late at night, Seren comforting others in their grief, Seren performing small acts of kindness that he had never known about. She never lost her faith, Vesper whispered, tears streaming down her face. Even at the end, when the pain was worst, she believed. Callum felt something break inside him, not the violent shattering of his earlier anger, but a gentle crumbling of the walls he had built around his grief. I didn't know, he said, touching the frost-covered window. I was so focused on my own pain, my own anger. I never saw. The presence in the room seemed to pulse in response to his words, and suddenly the temperature began to rise, the frost pattern slowly fading from the windows. The humming softened to a gentle whisper before falling silent altogether, leaving the three of them standing in the quiet kitchen, the air heavy with unspoken understanding. Father Ambrose placed a hand on Callum's shoulder. What happened in the cathedral today wasn't just an act of defiance, my son. It was a cry for help, one that was heard more clearly than you know. But why? Callum asked, turning to face the priest. Why all of this? The lights, the frost, the memories? Perhaps, Father Ambrose said thoughtfully, because sometimes we need to be shown the truth in ways our grief-clouded hearts can understand. Sometimes the answer to our prayers comes not in the form we expect, but in the form we need. Vesper moved to the kitchen table, beginning to set out the food she had brought. Whatever the reason, she said firmly, you're not facing this alone. We're here, Callum. We've always been here. As they sat down to eat, the last traces of frost melted from the windows, leaving them clear and ordinary once more. But Callum knew that nothing would ever be ordinary again. Something had changed, not just in the cathedral that morning, but in the very fabric of his understanding. And though he couldn't yet see where this path would lead, he felt for the first time since Seren's death that perhaps there was purpose to his pain after all. Outside, the lights of Thornhaven Moor twinkled in the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral began to toll, their sound carrying on the night air like a reminder that some questions have answers too profound for words alone to express. Dawn broke over Thornhaven Moor with an unusual brilliance, the morning light seeming to linger on the spires of St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral. In the town square, early risers gathered in hushed groups, their conversations centered on the strange events of the previous day. The air itself felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made even the most skeptical townspeople glance nervously at the cathedral's silhouette against the morning sky. Inside the Thornhaven Commons, Thalia Whitmore had called an emergency meeting of the town council. The elderly woman sat at the head of the long oak table, her silver hair gleaming in the early light, as she addressed the gathered officials. "We cannot ignore what's happening," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of her position as town elder. First the incident at the cathedral, and now reports of strange lights and frost throughout the town. Something must be done. Dr. Cassius Flynn cleared his throat, his medical training warring with what he had witnessed. "Perhaps we should consider a more scientific explanation," he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "The human mind, especially under stress—" "With all due respect, Doctor," Sylvan Reed interrupted, "I saw those symbols on the cathedral floor. We all did. And what happened at Callum's house last night, that was no trick of the mind." The debate might have continued, but at that moment, the door opened and Father Ambrose entered, looking tired but composed. The room fell silent as he made his way to the table, all eyes fixed on his weathered face. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "But we must proceed with caution and compassion. What we're witnessing, it's beyond any of our experiences." Meanwhile, across town, Callum Thorne stood at his kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. He hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. The events of the past 24 hours played through his mind in an endless loop. But something had changed within him. The raw anger that had driven him to tear the Bible had been replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name. A knock at his door revealed Vesper Vale, carrying fresh coffee and pastries from the Wayfarers' Market. "I thought you might need these," she said, stepping inside. She paused, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "You haven't slept." "How could I?" Callum asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Every time I close my eyes, I see those patterns, those memories of Seren. It's like seeing our whole life together from a different perspective." Vesper set the pastries on the table, then moved to stand beside him at the window. "The whole town's talking about what happened. Ash Winters swears he saw angels in the frost patterns at the cathedral this morning." "Angels?" Callum's laugh held no humor. "Or demons? After what I did." "Stop," Vesper said firmly, turning to face him. "Whatever's happening here, it's not about punishment. You saw those memories of Seren. They weren't meant to hurt you. They were meant to show you something." Before Callum could respond, a strange shimmer appeared in the air between them. The temperature dropped suddenly, and that now familiar humming filled the room. But this time, instead of frost patterns, the air itself seemed to crystallize, forming transparent shapes that caught and refracted the morning light. "It's beautiful," Vesper whispered, reaching out to touch one of the floating crystals. As her fingers made contact, a small burst of light emanated from the point of touch, and a sound like distant choir music filled the room. The door burst open, and Ash Winters rushed in, his young face flushed with excitement. "Father Ambrose sent me," he gasped. "The cathedral. You need to come see this." Callum and Vesper exchanged glances before following Ash through the streets of Thornhaven Moor. As they approached St. Chrysanthemum's, they could see a crowd gathered outside, their faces turned upward in wonder. The stained glass windows were alive with light, but not from the morning sun. The light seemed to come from within the glass itself, pulsing with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Father Ambrose stood at the cathedral steps, his hands clasped before him in prayer. As Callum approached, the priest opened his eyes and smiled gently. "It's been like this since dawn," he said. "But that's not all. Come inside." The interior of the cathedral took Callum's breath away. The torn pages of the Bible he had destroyed still lay scattered across the floor, but now each page seemed to glow with an inner light. As they watched, the pages began to move of their own accord, lifting into the air and swirling in a gentle vortex. "They've been doing this for hours," Father Ambrose explained. "Watch." The pages continued their dance, and as they moved, words became visible on them. Not the printed words of Scripture, but new text written in light. Vesper gasped as she recognized the handwriting. That's Serene's handwriting," she said, her voice trembling. Callum stepped forward, his heart pounding. The pages swirled around him, and he could read fragments of text, pieces of Serene's private prayers, her thoughts, her hopes, her deep and abiding faith even in her final days. Each word seemed to pulse with its own light, creating a symphony of illumination that filled the cathedral. "I don't understand," Callum whispered, watching as the pages continued their ethereal dance. "Why is this happening?" Father Ambrose placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps," he said softly, "because sometimes we need to see faith through another's eyes to understand its true power. Serene's faith wasn't blind, Callum. It was a choice she made every day, even in her suffering." The humming that had followed Callum began again, but this time it harmonized with the choir-like music they had heard earlier, creating a melody that seemed to speak directly to the soul. The floating pages began to descend slowly, arranging themselves on the altar in a pattern that resembled a cross. As the last page settled into place, a wave of warmth swept through the cathedral, dispelling the earlier chill. The light from the stained glass windows intensified for a moment, then returned to normal, leaving the gathered crowd in stunned silence. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Father Ambrose said quietly, "but always with purpose. What you did yesterday, Callum, your act of defiance, it didn't drive God away. Instead, It opened a door for His grace to be revealed in a way we've never seen before. Callum stared at the arranged pages on the altar, his vision blurring with tears. In challenging God so directly, had he inadvertently created a channel for something divine to manifest? The anger that had driven him to tear the Bible seemed distant now, replaced by a growing sense of awe and wonder. As the morning light streamed through the windows, casting rainbow patterns across the cathedral floor, Callum felt something he hadn't experienced since Serene's death, a flicker of hope, small but undeniable, like a candle flame in the darkness. Whatever was happening in Thornhaven Moor, whatever force had been awakened by his actions, it was clear that this was only the beginning of a journey he never expected to take. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the streets of Thornhaven Moor as pilgrims began to arrive. Word of the miraculous events at St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral had spread beyond the town's borders, drawing curious visitors from neighboring communities. They came with cameras and smartphones, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural phenomena, but their devices mysteriously malfunctioned whenever they tried to document the glowing pages or the strange lights. Inside the Thornhaven Commons, Dr. Cassius Flynn stood before a hastily assembled group of town officials and local leaders, including Father Ambrose and Thalia Whitmore. The doctor had spent the morning examining the physical evidence of the strange occurrences, the frost patterns, the crystalline formations in the air, the inexplicable lights. From a scientific standpoint, none of this makes sense, he admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. The temperature variations alone defy natural law, and the spectral analysis of the light emissions from the stained glass. I've never seen anything like it. Father Ambrose listened patiently, his weathered hands folded on the table before him. Perhaps, Doctor, we're witnessing something that bridges the gap between faith and science, something that cannot be fully explained by either alone. Meanwhile, at the cathedral, Vesper Vale and Ash Winters were helping to manage the growing crowd of visitors. The young church assistant had taken to documenting every supernatural occurrence in a leather-bound journal, his neat handwriting filling page after page with observations and sketches. "Look at this," Ash called to Vesper, pointing to a new development. The glowing pages on the altar had begun to arrange themselves in different patterns, forming what appeared to be complex geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm. Vesper approached carefully, studying the shifting patterns. "Has anyone shown this to Callum yet?" she asked, knowing that every new manifestation seemed somehow connected to him. "I'm right here," Callum's voice came from the cathedral entrance. He looked different today. The dark circles under his eyes remained, but there was a new alertness in his gaze, a sense of purpose that had been missing since Serene's death. As he walked down the center aisle, the pages on the altar began to move more rapidly, their glow intensifying. The familiar humming filled the air, but now it was accompanied by what sounded like distant whispers, countless voices speaking in languages no one could understand. "It responds to you," Vesper observed, watching as the pages swirled into a new configuration. "Like it knows you're here." Callum reached the altar and stood before the floating pages. As he watched, words began to form in Serene's handwriting once again. But this time they were different. Not prayers or memories, but what appeared to be instructions. "Look beyond the veil," the glowing text read. "The walls between worlds grow thin. What was broken must be mended, not by force, but by understanding." Father Ambrose, who had returned from the town meeting, stepped forward to read the message. "Interesting," he murmured. "It seems we're being given guidance." Before anyone could respond, a new phenomenon began. The light from the stained glass windows started to bend and twist, forming corridors of radiance that stretched through the air like bridges made of pure light. The temperature in the cathedral fluctuated wildly, warm one moment, cold the next, as if the very fabric of reality was being reshaped. "Everyone step back," Father Ambrose commanded, but Callum remained rooted in place, transfixed by what he was seeing. Within the corridors of light, images began to form. Not just memories this time, but what appeared to be glimpses of other places, other moments in time. "I can see." Callum's voice trailed off as he stared into one of the light bridges. I can see the day I first met Seren, but it's different somehow. I can see everything, every detail I missed, every moment I took for granted. Vesper moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his in the strange light. What else do you see? I see her last days in the hospital, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, but I'm seeing them from her perspective. She wasn't afraid, Vesper. She was. At peace. How could she be at peace when I was falling apart? The light corridors shifted, showing new images. Moments from throughout Thornhaven Moor's history, times of trial and triumph, all connected by threads of faith and community. The cathedral itself seemed to pulse with energy, as if it had become a living thing, a vessel for something far greater than itself. Ash furiously scribbled in his journal, trying to capture every detail of what was unfolding. "This is unprecedented," he muttered. "The manifestations are growing stronger, more focused." Father Ambrose raised his hands in prayer, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. "Lord, guide us to understand what you are showing us. Help us to see with clear eyes and open hearts." As if in response to his prayer, the light corridors began to converge, forming a single brilliant column that stretched from floor to ceiling. Within it, a figure began to take shape, not fully formed but suggested in light and shadow, a presence that emanated both power and peace. Callum stepped forward, drawn by an irresistible force. The temperature around him dropped sharply, his breath visible in the sudden cold, but he felt no fear. The figure in the light reached out, and though no physical contact was made, Callum felt something touch his soul, a gesture of infinite compassion and understanding. "This is what she felt," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "This is what Seren knew, what she tried to tell me. It's not about blind faith or easy answers. It's about connection, about being part of something larger than ourselves." The figure in the light nodded, or seemed to, and the column of radiance began to fade. As it disappeared, the pages on the altar settled into a new pattern, a perfect spiral that seemed to represent both an ending and a beginning. Vesper approached Callum carefully, noticing how he seemed transformed by the experience. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He turned to her, his eyes shining with something that looked like revelation. I think I'm starting to understand. What happened here when I tore the Bible, it wasn't just an act of destruction. It was a cry for help, yes, but it was also an opening, a chance for something miraculous to enter our world." Father Ambrose nodded solemnly. "Sometimes, my son, our greatest moments of doubt become the foundation for our strongest faith. Not because we stop questioning, but because we learn to see the answers in new ways." Outside the cathedral, the crowd of pilgrims had grown larger, their murmured prayers and expressions of awe creating a low hum that seemed to harmonize with the supernatural resonance still filling the air. Thornhaven Moor was changing, transformed by the events unfolding within its sacred spaces, and no one who witnessed these miracles would ever be quite the same. As twilight descended over Thornhaven Moor, the town had taken on an almost dreamlike quality. The streets surrounding St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral were filled with candlelight, as hundreds of visitors maintained their vigil outside the sacred building. The soft glow of their candles created a sea of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the mysterious energies emanating from within the cathedral. Inside his study, Father Ambrose sat with a collection of ancient texts spread before him, his tired eyes scanning centuries-old accounts of miraculous events. Ash Winters stood nearby, comparing his detailed notes with the historical records. "There's nothing quite like this in any of the church histories," the young assistant said, frustration evident in his voice. "The closest parallel I can find is from 1847, when a similar light phenomenon was reported in a monastery in Eastern Europe, but even that pales in comparison to what we're witnessing." Father Ambrose leaned back in his chair, removing his reading glasses. "Perhaps that's because we're not meant to find precedent for this, Ash. What's happening here may be entirely new, a unique manifestation for unique times." Their discussion was interrupted by an urgent knock. Dr. Cassius Flynn entered, carrying a stack of medical reports and scientific readings. "Father, you need to see this," he said, spreading the papers across the desk. "The electromagnetic readings around the cathedral are off the charts and they're spreading throughout the town. But here's the strange part. They're not random. There's a pattern to them, almost like a heartbeat." Ash finished, recognition dawning on his face. "The same rhythm we've been hearing in the humming." Meanwhile, at his home, Callum Thorne sat in his living room with Vesper Vale, both of them watching as the now familiar crystalline formations danced in the air around them. But tonight they were different, more complex, more purposeful in their movements. "They're trying to show us something," Vesper observed, watching as the crystals arranged themselves into intricate patterns. "Look, don't they remind you of the illustrations in Seren's old sketchbooks?" Callum nodded slowly. During her illness, Seren had filled notebook after notebook with drawings, abstract patterns that she claimed came to her in dreams. At the time, he had attributed them to the medication, but now she was seeing this, he whispered. All along, she was seeing what was coming. He stood up, moving to the bookshelf where he kept Seren's sketchbooks. As he pulled them down, the crystalline formations in the air seemed to respond, their light intensifying. With trembling hands, Callum opened the first sketchbook. Page after page of intricate designs, spirals, geometric patterns, flowing lines that seemed to capture movement itself, all eerily similar to the manifestations they had been witnessing. "That's not all," Vesper said softly, pulling a small diary from her bag. "I found this at my house this morning. Seren left it with me before the end. She made me promise not to read it until the time was right. I think that time is now." Together they opened the diary. Serene's elegant handwriting filled the pages. But as they watched, certain words began to glow with the same ethereal light they had seen in the cathedral. "My dearest Callum," the illuminated words read, "if you're reading this, then what I saw in my dreams has come to pass. Don't blame yourself for what you did in the cathedral. Your act of despair was meant to be the key that opened the door. Sometimes we must break before we can be remade." The crystals in the air swirled more rapidly now, their light creating patterns on the walls that matched the drawings in Seren's sketchbooks perfectly. The temperature in the room dropped, and that familiar humming began again, but this time it seemed to carry fragments of Serene's voice. Suddenly, a knock at the door startled them both. Thalia Whitmore stood on the threshold, her silver hair glowing in the strange light. "You need to come to the cathedral," she said without preamble. "Something's happening." When they arrived at St. Chrysanthemum's, they found the building transformed. The stained glass windows were alive with moving images, not just static scenes of saints and biblical stories, but flowing, changing tableaux that seemed to tell an endless story. The glowing pages of the torn Bible had arranged themselves into a complex three-dimensional structure that hovered above the altar, rotating slowly in the air. Father Ambrose and Dr. Flynn stood near the altar, their faces illuminated by the supernatural light. As Callum approached, the pages began to move more quickly and the humming grew louder. "The readings are stronger than ever," Dr. Flynn reported, checking his instruments. "And look at this." He pointed to where the frost patterns were forming on the floor, but instead of random crystalline shapes, they were writing out words in multiple languages, some ancient, some modern, all glowing with inner light. "It's a message," Father Ambrose said, his voice filled with wonder. "But it's more than that. It's a conversation, between worlds, between realities, and somehow, Callum, you and Seren are at the center of it." The figure of light they had seen earlier began to form again, but this time it was clearer, more defined. As it took shape, Callum felt his heart stop. There was something familiar in its bearing, in the way it moved. "Seren?" he whispered, but Vesper's hand on his arm stopped him from stepping forward. "Not exactly," Father Ambrose said quietly. "I believe what we're seeing is something far more complex. A manifestation of divine grace, using a form that you would recognize and respond to. The veil between worlds has grown thin here, allowing us to perceive things normally hidden from human eyes." The figure raised its hands, and suddenly the entire cathedral was filled with flowing scenes. Moments from not just Callum's life with Seren, but from the lives of everyone present. They saw connections they had never noticed before, patterns of love and faith and sacrifice that wove through all their stories. "My God," Dr. Flynn breathed, his scientific skepticism forgotten in the face of such overwhelming evidence of the miraculous. "It's showing us how we're all connected." The manifestation seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment, the light more intense, the images more vivid. The very air seemed to vibrate with sacred energy, and the sound of distant bells mixed with the ethereal humming that had become so familiar. As they watched in awe, none of them noticed the small group of strangers who had slipped into the cathedral, people who had traveled far after hearing rumors of the miracles in Thornhaven Moor, people who would soon play their own role in the unfolding mystery that had begun with one man's act of desperate defiance. The group of strangers stood at the back of St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral, their presence creating ripples of curiosity among the gathered townspeople. They were 7 in total, each bearing an air of quiet purpose that set them apart from the other pilgrims who had flocked to Thornhaven Moor. The eldest among them, a woman with striking white hair and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, stepped forward first. She introduced herself as Sister Helena of the Order of Divine Mysteries, a name that caused Father Ambrose to inhale sharply in recognition. "We've been watching," Sister Helena said, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral despite its softness. "When the signs began appearing, we knew we had to come." Callum turned from the hovering figure of light to study these newcomers. Beside Sister Helena, there was a young monk with burn scars covering one side of his face, an elderly man who leaned on a staff carved with mysterious symbols, and 4 others who seemed to radiate their own subtle energy. "What signs?" Father Ambrose asked, moving to greet them properly. "What do you know about what's happening here?" Sister Helena's eyes moved to the glowing pages still rotating above the altar. "Throughout history, there have been moments when the divine breaks through into our world in unprecedented ways. We call them thresholds of grace, times when human actions, whether born of faith or despair, create openings for something greater to manifest." The scarred monk stepped forward, introducing himself as Brother Marcus. "What happened here?" he said, gesturing to Callum. "When you tore the Bible, it wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a catalyst, chosen by forces beyond our understanding." As if in response to his words, the crystalline formations in the air began to shift and change, creating new patterns that seemed to echo the carvings on the elderly man's staff. The humming that had become so familiar took on a new tone, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. Vesper moved closer to Callum, watching as the newcomers spread out through the cathedral, each taking up positions that seemed somehow predetermined. "How did they know to come here?" she whispered. "The same way I knew to leave this for you," a new voice said. Everyone turned to see Thalia Whitmore entering the cathedral, carrying an ancient-looking book bound in weathered leather. "Some of us have been waiting for this moment for a very long time." The elderly woman approached the altar, placing the book carefully on its surface. As soon as she did, the floating pages of the torn Bible began to respond, their glow intensifying and their movement becoming more purposeful. "Thalia?" Father Ambrose asked, confusion evident in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I was like you once, Callum," Thalia said, turning to face him. "Young, angry, questioning everything I believed in. And like you, I experienced something that changed everything. But in my case, it came with a responsibility, to watch and wait for the next threshold." The figure of light above the altar seemed to pulse in recognition of her words. The temperature in the cathedral began to fluctuate again, and the stained glass windows blazed with new intensity. Dr. Flynn, who had been quietly taking readings on his instrument, suddenly looked up in amazement. "The energy patterns," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "They're exactly the same as the ones recorded in Sister Helena's order 50 years ago, during the last threshold event." Brother Marcus nodded solemnly. "Each threshold is different, but they all share certain characteristics. The light, the changes in physical laws, the thinning of the veil between worlds. But this one. He paused, looking around the cathedral with an expression of awe. This one is stronger than any we've seen before. As if to confirm his words, the glowing pages suddenly burst into new motion, swirling around the cathedral in a complex dance before reforming into a series of interlocking spheres above the altar. Within each sphere, images began to appear, scenes from different times and places, all connected by threads of golden light. "Look," Vesper gasped, pointing to one of the spheres. "That's Seren's hospital room, but it's different somehow." Indeed, the scene showed Seren in her final days, but from an angle impossible for human eyes. They could see not just her physical form, but what appeared to be her very soul, glowing with an inner light that pulsed in perfect rhythm with the humming that filled the cathedral. "She knew," Sister Helena said softly, watching the scene unfold. "Some souls are chosen as anchors for these events. They help prepare the way, even if they don't fully understand their role." Callum felt tears running down his face as he watched the scene, understanding finally dawning. "All those drawings," he whispered. "All those patterns she kept seeing in her dreams. She was seeing this, wasn't she? She was seeing what was coming." The elderly man with the staff, who had introduced himself simply as the Keeper, stepped forward. "Your wife was a vessel of grace, Mr. Thorne. Her faith, her acceptance, her love, they all helped create the conditions necessary for this threshold. And your act of despair was the key that opened the door." The crystalline formations in the air began to take on new shapes, forming what looked like doorways of light throughout the cathedral. Through each one, they could see glimpses of other places, other times, all connected by the same divine presence that had been manifesting since Callum's act of defiance. "But why?" Callum asked, his voice breaking. "Why all of this? What's the purpose?" Sister Helena smiled gently. "Sometimes, Mr. Thorne, the greatest acts of divine love come disguised as moments of deepest despair. What's happening here isn't just about you, or even about Thornhaven Moor. It's about reminding humanity that the veil between heaven and earth is thinner than we imagine, and that even our moments of greatest doubt can become gateways to profound grace." As she spoke, the figure of light above the altar began to multiply, forming a circle of radiant beings that filled the cathedral with their presence. The humming grew stronger, more complex, becoming a symphony of supernatural harmonies that seemed to speak directly to the soul. Father Ambrose, watching all of this unfold, finally understood the full magnitude of what they were witnessing. "This isn't just a miracle," he said softly. "This is a transformation of this place, of all of us, and it's only beginning." As night fell over Thornhaven Moor, St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral had become a beacon of supernatural light visible for miles around. The 7 members of the Order of Divine Mysteries had taken positions around the interior, forming a perfect circle that seemed to amplify the already extraordinary phenomena taking place within the sacred space. Sister Helena stood at the altar, carefully examining the ancient book Thalia had brought forth. Her fingers traced the illuminated text with reverence, while Brother Marcus and the Keeper flanked her on either side, their own energies seeming to resonate with the supernatural forces filling the cathedral. "This is remarkable," Sister Helena murmured, her eyes widening as she turned another page. "Thalia, you've been protecting this text all these years?" The elderly town elder nodded, her silver hair catching the ethereal light. "It was passed to me by my predecessor, just as it was passed to her. We've always known Thornhaven Moor was special, that it was meant to be a site of divine manifestation. We just didn't know when or how it would happen." The crystalline formations that had become so familiar now took on new complexity, forming what appeared to be living geometric patterns that shifted and evolved with each passing moment. Dr. Flynn had given up trying to record readings, his scientific instruments having short-circuited from the intense energy pervading the space. "Look at this," Brother Marcus said, pointing to a particular passage in the ancient text. "It speaks of a great convergence, a moment when multiple thresholds of grace align, creating a permanent bridge between the divine and earthly realms." Callum, who had been quietly observing with Vesper at his side, stepped forward. "And you think that's what's happening here?" "More than that," the keeper said, leaning on his carved staff. "We believe your wife Seren was aware of this potential. Her drawings, her diary entries. They weren't just visions, they were blueprints for what's unfolding now." As if in response to his words, the glowing pages of the torn Bible began to move again, but this time they formed a complex three-dimensional map of intersecting light paths throughout the cathedral. Within each intersection point, new images appeared, scenes from Seren's life, but viewed from a perspective that revealed the divine presence that had always been there, guiding and preparing. "She saw it all," Vesper whispered, watching the displays with tears in her eyes. Even in her suffering, she understood something greater was at work. Father Ambrose, who had been deep in prayer, suddenly looked up. "The temperature's changing again," he announced, just as a wave of warmth swept through the cathedral, followed by an intense cold that made everyone's breath visible in the air. The 4 other members of the order, who had introduced themselves as the witnesses, began to chant in an ancient language that seemed to harmonize with the ever-present humming. As their voices rose and fell, the stained glass windows began to ripple like liquid, their colors flowing and merging in impossible ways. "It's beginning," Sister Helena said, her voice filled with quiet awe. "The convergence is starting to manifest." The figure of light that had appeared earlier now multiplied exponentially, filling the cathedral with radiant beings that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. They moved through the space with purpose, their presence causing the very air to shimmer with divine energy. Ash Winters, who had been documenting everything in his journal, suddenly noticed something extraordinary. "The writing," he called out, pointing to his pages. "It's changing on its own." Indeed, as they watched, his careful notes began to transform, the ink flowing and reforming into new text, ancient prophecies and future revelations intermingling on the pages in a dance of divine revelation. "My God," Dr. Flynn breathed, forgetting his scientific skepticism in the face of undeniable miracle. "It's as if reality itself is being rewritten." The keeper stepped forward, his staff now glowing with the same light that filled the cathedral. "Not rewritten, Doctor. Revealed. We're seeing reality as it truly is, unfiltered by human limitation." Callum felt something shift within his soul as he watched the manifestations unfold. The anger that had driven him to tear the Bible seemed like a lifetime ago, replaced by a profound sense of purpose he couldn't yet fully understand. "Seren knew," he said softly, more to himself than to those around him. "She knew this would happen, knew what my grief would drive me to do. She wasn't just accepting her death. She was preparing the way for something greater." Sister Helena approached him, her ancient eyes filled with compassion. "Your wife was what we call a divine anchor, a soul chosen to help facilitate these moments of sacred transformation. Her faith, her acceptance, her love, they all helped create the conditions necessary for this threshold to open." As she spoke, the crystalline formations in the air began to coalesce into a single massive structure that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Within it, they could see what appeared to be multiple realities overlapping, heaven and earth intersecting in ways that defied human understanding. "But what happens now?" Vesper asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "What does all this mean for Thornhaven Moor? For all of us?" The keeper smiled, a knowing light in his eyes. "That, my dear, depends on what happens next. The convergence has begun, but its ultimate manifestation will be shaped by the choices made here, in this sacred space, by those who have been called to witness it." As if in response to his words, the supernatural light intensified, and the humming took on a new tone, one that seemed to call to something deep within each person present. The time of revelation was approaching, and with it decisions that would affect not just Thornhaven Moor, but the very nature of faith itself. The astronomical clock in St. Chrysanthemum's tower struck midnight, its chimes merging with the supernatural harmonies that filled the cathedral. Outside, the gathering crowd of pilgrims and townspeople had grown silent, watching in awe as waves of ethereal light pulsed through the stained glass windows with increasing intensity. Inside, the 7 members of the Order of Divine Mysteries had begun what Sister Helena called the anchoring ritual. They stood in their circular formation, their voices raised in an ancient chant that seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of reality. The crystalline structure floating above the altar had grown more complex, its facets reflecting not just light but what appeared to be moments in time, past, present, and possibilities yet to come. "The convergence is accelerating," the keeper announced, his staff now hovering horizontally before him, untouched by human hands. "The veils between worlds are growing thinner with each passing moment." Callum stood at the center of the circle, where Sister Helena had positioned him. The floating pages of the torn Bible orbited around him like a constellation of sacred text, each page now glowing with such intensity that the words seemed to burn in the air. "I can feel her," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Seren, she's here, isn't she? Not just in memory, but really here." Brother Marcus, his scarred face illuminated by the supernatural light, nodded solemnly. "The divine anchors never truly leave us, Mr. Thorne. They exist in a state of grace that transcends ordinary death. Your wife's presence is very real. She's helping to guide this transformation." As if to confirm his words, the figure of light that had appeared earlier began to take on an even more distinct form. Though not fully corporeal, its features were now clearly recognizable as Seren's, but transformed, radiant with divine light and purpose. Vesper, watching from near the altar, gasped as new writing appeared in Seren's diary, which lay open before her. "Look at this," she called out, her voice trembling. "It's happening right now. New words, new prophecies." Father Ambrose moved to read the freshly manifested text, his eyes widening as the words appeared. "The convergence comes not to end what was, but to begin what must be. Through broken faith, whole faith is born. Through deepest doubt, truest belief emerges. The tear in the sacred text becomes a door through which divine light pours, transforming not just one soul, but all who witness." Dr. Flynn, who had been attempting to document the phenomena with his backup equipment, suddenly noticed something extraordinary on his instruments. "The energy readings," he announced, his scientific demeanor cracking with excitement. "They're forming a pattern identical to human brainwaves during moments of profound spiritual experience, but amplified beyond anything we've ever recorded. The witnesses, the 4 other members of the Order who had maintained their silent vigil, began to move in perfect synchronization, their robes flowing with an energy that seemed to defy gravity. As they moved, the crystalline formations in the air responded, creating new geometric patterns that matched the ancient symbols carved into the Keeper's staff." "The patterns!" Ash Winters exclaimed, his journal now floating before him as he frantically tried to sketch what he was seeing. "They're the same as in Seren's sketchbooks, exactly the same." Thalia Whitmore stepped forward, the ancient book she had protected for so long now hovering open before her. "It's all connected," she said, her voice carrying a weight of understanding. "Every vision, every drawing, every moment of preparation, it was all leading to this." The temperature in the cathedral began to fluctuate wildly again, but this time there was a pattern to the changes. Waves of warm and cold that pulsed in rhythm with the humming that filled the space. The stained glass windows had become like liquid light, their colors flowing and merging in ways that defied physical law. "The convergence reaches its peak," Sister Helena announced, her white hair now floating around her head like a halo. "Mr. Thorne, you must make a choice now. One that will affect not just this moment, but all moments to come." Callum looked at her, then at the radiant figure of Seren hovering nearby. "What choice? What am I supposed to do?" "The tear you made in the Bible," the Keeper explained. "It created an opening. But now you must decide, will you help us seal it, returning things to as they were, or will you help us transform it into a permanent threshold of grace?" The implications of the choice hung in the air like a tangible weight. The crystalline structure above the altar pulsed with increasing intensity, and the pages of the torn Bible began to move more rapidly around Callum. If you choose to seal it, Brother Marcus added, his voice gentle, these manifestations will end. The veil between worlds will return to its former strength. The pain that drove you to tear the Bible can be healed in time, through ordinary grace. But if you choose transformation, Sister Helena continued, what's happening here will become permanent. Thornhaven Moor will become a sacred site unlike any other, a place where the divine and earthly realms intersect continuously. It will never be the same, and neither will you. Vesper moved to stand beside Callum, taking his hand. Whatever you choose, she said softly, you're not alone. The radiant figure of Seren seemed to smile, extending a hand of light toward Callum. In that moment, he could feel her presence more strongly than ever, not as a ghost or memory, but as a living force of divine love and purpose. Father Ambrose watched with bated breath, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for generations to come. The choice facing Callum was not just personal, it would affect every soul in Thornhaven Moor, and perhaps beyond. Choose wisely, the keeper said, his staff now pulsing with the same light that filled the cathedral. But know this, there is no wrong choice. Both paths lead to healing, though in very different ways. The supernatural light intensified, and the humming grew louder, as if all of creation was holding its breath waiting for Callum's decision. In that moment of crystal clarity, he finally understood why Seren had been so peaceful in her final days. She had seen this moment coming, had known that even in death she would be part of something greater than herself. Callum Thorne stood at the center of St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral, surrounded by swirling pages of the torn Bible and bathed in supernatural light. The choice before him seemed to make the very air heavy with possibility. Time itself appeared to slow, each moment stretching into eternity as he looked into the radiant figure of Seren hovering before him. I understand now, he said softly, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed cathedral. All this time, I thought faith was about having answers, but it's about something else entirely, isn't it? Sister Helena nodded, her ancient eyes filled with wisdom. Faith is not the absence of doubt, Mr. Thorne. It's the courage to keep seeking truth even when the path seems darkest. The crystalline structure above the altar had grown to encompass nearly the entire ceiling, its facets reflecting countless moments of divine intersection throughout history. Within its shifting surfaces, Callum could see other moments like this one, other times when the veil between worlds had grown thin, when ordinary people had been called to extraordinary choices. Show me, he said, addressing not just those present, but the divine presence that filled the space. Show me what each choice means. The keeper raised his staff, and suddenly the cathedral was filled with two distinct visions. On one side, they saw Thornhaven Moor as it could be if Callum chose to seal the threshold. Peaceful, healed, but ordinary. The pain would fade in time and life would return to normal. The miraculous events would become a memory, a story told in hushed voices. On the other side, they saw a different future, one where the town became a permanent intersection of divine and earthly realms. The cathedral would remain a place of ongoing revelation, where the barriers between heaven and earth stayed perpetually thin. But with that glory came responsibility, and a knowledge that could never be unknown. Dr. Flynn, watching the visions unfold, checked his instruments one last time. The energy patterns, he reported, his voice filled with wonder. They're showing two distinct possibilities, two complete and separate reality structures, both equally viable. Brother Marcus stepped forward, his scarred face solemn. Remember, Mr. Thorne, this choice affects not just you, but every soul in Thornhaven Moor. To live at a threshold of grace is no small thing. It will change everything and everyone. The four witnesses began to move again, their synchronized movements creating patterns of light that danced through the air. As they moved, the humming that filled the cathedral took on new harmonies, becoming a symphony of possibility. Vesper squeezed Callum's hand, her presence an anchor in the sea of supernatural energy. Whatever you choose, she whispered, we face it together. Father Ambrose watched from near the altar, his weathered face reflecting both anxiety and hope. He had served this community for decades, but never had he imagined being part of something so profound. The very foundations of faith were being reshaped before his eyes. Ash Winters had stopped trying to document everything, his journal floating forgotten beside him as he watched the visions unfold. The young church assistant's face showed the same awe that marked everyone present, the recognition that they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary understanding. Thalia Whitmore stepped forward, the ancient book still hovering before her. "The prophecies speak of this moment," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "They say the choice must come from love, not fear. From understanding, not desperation." The radiant figure of Seren seemed to pulse with increased intensity, and suddenly Callum could hear her voice, not with his ears, but in his heart. The words were not in any human language, but he understood them perfectly. They spoke of love that transcended death, of purpose that spanned eternity, of truth that could only be found in the space between doubt and belief. "I tore the Bible because I couldn't understand why God would take you from me," Callum said, addressing the figure of light. "But you never left, did you? You were preparing the way for this moment." The crystalline structure above began to pulse in rhythm with his words, and the torn pages of the Bible swirled faster around him. The temperature in the cathedral fluctuated between warm and cold, as if reality itself was breathing. Sister Helena raised her hands, and the other members of the order followed suit. "The moment of choice is upon us," she announced. "The convergence reaches its peak." Outside, the gathered crowd gasped as the entire cathedral began to glow with an intensity that made it look like a palace of pure light. The stained glass windows were now completely fluid, their colors flowing like liquid rainbows down the ancient walls. Dr. Flynn's remaining instruments sparked and died as the energy levels exceeded anything they could measure. The very air seemed to crackle with divine presence, and the humming grew so intense it seemed to vibrate in their very souls. Callum looked at each face in turn. Father Ambrose's patient wisdom, Vesper's unwavering support, the Order's ancient knowledge, the town's collective hope. Then he looked at the radiant figure of Seren, seeing in her transformed presence everything he had failed to understand about faith and love. "I know what I have to do," he said finally, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. The choice crystallized in his heart with perfect clarity. Not just an answer to his own pain, but a response to a divine invitation that had been waiting since the beginning of time. The keeper nodded solemnly, understanding dawning in his ancient eyes. "Then let it be done," he said, raising his staff as the cathedral filled with light so bright it seemed to erase the boundaries between heaven and earth, between past and future, between doubt and faith. In that moment of decision, as Callum opened his mouth to speak his choice, all of Thornhaven Moor held its breath, waiting to learn what future would unfold from this extraordinary convergence of divine and human will. "I choose transformation," Callum's voice rang out through St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral, the words seeming to ripple through multiple dimensions at once, not just for myself but for all of us. The moment the words left his lips, the cathedral erupted in supernatural light. The crystalline structure above the altar shattered into millions of points of radiance that rained down like stars, each mote of light carrying within it a fragment of divine revelation. The torn pages of the Bible, still orbiting Callum, began to glow with an intensity that made them look like sheets of pure gold. Sister Helena's face broke into a smile of profound joy. "And so it begins," she said, her voice carrying an almost musical quality. "The permanent threshold of grace." The transformation started at the altar and spread outward in waves. The stone floors of the cathedral began to shimmer with an inner light, as if they were becoming transparent enough to see the sacred foundations upon which they were built. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched the ever-present humming. "Remarkable," Dr. Flynn whispered, watching as his last functioning instrument displayed readings that defied all known laws of physics. The energy patterns. They're not just changing the cathedral, they're changing the fundamental structure of reality in this space. The keeper planted his staff firmly on the ground, and from that point, Lines of golden light began to spread across the floor in intricate patterns that matched both the symbols in Serene's sketchbooks and the ancient text Thalia had protected for so long. "The patterns," Ash Winters exclaimed, his floating journal now writing by itself, recording events as they unfolded. "They're creating a permanent matrix, a framework for ongoing divine manifestation." Brother Marcus and the four witnesses began to move in a complex ceremonial pattern, their movements leaving trails of light in the air that wove themselves into the growing transformation. As they moved, their shadows seemed to multiply and shift, as if they existed in multiple realities simultaneously. The radiant figure of Seren grew more distinct, and now other figures of light began to appear alongside her. Countless souls who had served as divine anchors throughout history, each one contributing their own harmony to the supernatural symphony filling the space. Vesper, still holding Callum's hand, gasped as she began to see what was happening on a deeper level. "The veil isn't just thinning," she said in wonder. "It's being rewoven into something new, a permanent bridge between worlds." Father Ambrose watched in awe as his beloved cathedral transformed before his eyes. The sacred space he had served for decades was becoming something beyond his wildest dreams, a living testament to the reality of divine presence. "The transformation will extend beyond these walls," Sister Helena explained, her white hair now moving like a corona around her head. "All of Thornhaven Moor will become part of this sacred convergence, though the cathedral will remain its heart." Outside, the gathered crowd witnessed their town beginning to change. The light from the cathedral spread through the streets like flowing water, touching everything in its path. Where it passed, the ordinary became extraordinary. Trees began to shimmer with inner light. Streets reflected the sky like mirrors, and the very air seemed to carry whispers of divine presence. Thalia Whitmore's ancient book now hovered at the center of the cathedral, its pages turning by themselves as new text appeared. The ongoing story of what was unfolding, writing itself into the sacred record. "Every generation will add to this story," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "What begins here will continue as long as faith endures." The four witnesses began to sing in that ancient language, their voices weaving together with the humming that filled the air. As they sang, the stained glass windows transformed completely, becoming living portals that showed not just biblical scenes but ongoing revelations of divine truth. "Look," Brother Marcus called out, pointing to where the torn Bible pages had begun to take on new form. Instead of trying to restore themselves to their original state, they were transforming into something new, a living text that would continue to reveal divine truth in ways perfectly suited to each seeker who came to this place. Callum felt tears streaming down his face as he watched it all unfold. The pain that had driven him to tear the Bible hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed, becoming part of a larger story of redemption and revelation. "Serene knew," he said softly, looking at the radiant figure that had once been his wife. "She knew this was possible, that my pain could become a doorway to something greater." Sister Helena nodded, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Divine anchors see the bigger picture, Mr. Thorne. Your wife's acceptance of her death wasn't resignation. It was preparation for this moment of transformation." The keeper raised his staff once more, and suddenly everyone present could see Thornhaven Moor as it would now be, a place where the extraordinary had become ordinary, where divine presence was as natural as breathing, where every soul who came seeking would find exactly what they needed most. "It will not always be easy," he cautioned, his ancient eyes kind but serious. "Living at a threshold of grace requires constant awareness, constant openness to divine reality. The responsibility is as great as the blessing." As if to emphasize his words, the supernatural light began to stabilize, settling into a permanent state of heightened reality. The humming became a constant undertone to existence, like a celestial heartbeat that would forever remind them of their unique place in the divine plan. Father Ambrose stepped forward, his eyes shining with tears of joy. "We will need guidance," he said, looking at Sister Helena and the Order members. "This is beyond anything we could have imagined." "That is why we are here," Sister Helena replied with a gentle smile. The Order of Divine Mysteries will help establish the protocols, train those who will serve as guardians of this sacred space. Thornhaven Moor is now part of something greater than itself, a network of divine touchpoints throughout the world. As the transformation continued to unfold, Callum finally understood what Seren had tried to tell him in her final days: that death was not an ending but a transformation, that pain could become a gateway to grace, and that true faith was not about having all the answers, but about being willing to become part of a story greater than oneself. 1 month after the Great Transformation, St. Chrysanthemum's Cathedral had become a beacon of hope for seekers from around the world. The permanent threshold of grace that Callum's choice had established transformed Thornhaven Moor into a place where the extraordinary had become wonderfully ordinary, where divine presence was as tangible as sunlight. Standing in the cathedral's transformed interior, Callum watched as pilgrims moved reverently through the space, their faces filled with wonder as they encountered the living manifestations of divine grace. The torn Bible pages, now transformed into sheets of living light, continued to reveal new truths to each visitor who came seeking answers. "It never gets old, does it?" Vesper asked, joining him near the altar. In the weeks since the transformation, she had become one of the cathedral's primary guides, helping newcomers understand what they were experiencing. "No," Callum replied softly, watching as the crystalline formations in the air danced and shifted, responding to the prayers and hopes of those present. "Every day brings something new." Sister Helena and the Order of Divine Mysteries had kept their promise, establishing a permanent presence in Thornhaven Moor. They had converted the old Thornhaven Commons into a school of sacred studies, where people could learn to navigate the unique reality of living at a threshold of grace. The keeper, his ancient staff now permanently planted in the cathedral garden, had become a beloved figure in the town. Children gathered around him in the evenings to hear stories of other thresholds throughout history, while adults sought his wisdom in understanding the profound changes in their lives. "Mr. Thorne," a soft voice called. Callum turned to see Brother Marcus approaching, his scarred face serene in the supernatural light that had become their new normal. The morning revelation is about to begin. Each dawn now brought a unique manifestation of divine presence, as the veil between worlds grew thinnest with the rising sun. The townspeople had made it a tradition to gather in the cathedral at daybreak, witnessing whatever new wonder would unfold. As the first rays of sunlight struck the transformed stained glass windows, the air filled with that familiar humming. But now, after weeks of experience, they could hear the complex harmonies within it. The music of reality itself, played on divine instruments. The radiant figure of Seren appeared, as it did each morning. But she was no longer alone. She had become part of a continuous communion of divine anchors, souls who helped maintain the bridge between heaven and earth. Through their presence, the people of Thornhaven Moor had learned that death was not an ending but a transformation, not a wall but a door. "Look," Vesper whispered, pointing to where new text was appearing in Thalia's ancient book, which now hovered permanently above a special pedestal near the altar. "Today's revelation is beginning." The words wrote themselves in letters of light. "From deepest doubt, strongest faith emerges. From greatest loss, profound discovery grows. The tear in the sacred text becomes a window through which eternal truth shines, transforming not just one moment but all moments, not just one soul but all souls who seek with open hearts." Father Ambrose, who had adapted beautifully to his expanded role as guardian of a living miracle, stepped forward to read the message aloud. His voice carried clearly through the cathedral, touching each heart with its simple truth. Dr. Flynn, who had long since set aside his scientific instruments in favor of direct observation, nodded in understanding. He had learned that some truths could only be measured by their impact on the human heart. Ash Winters continued his documentation, though now his journal wrote itself, recording not just events but their deeper spiritual significance. He had become the official chronicler of Thornhaven Moor's transformation, ensuring that future generations would understand what had occurred here. The morning revelation reached its peak as the supernatural light formed new patterns throughout the cathedral. But now, unlike the chaos of that first dramatic day, the manifestations had a harmony to them, a a divine purpose that everyone could feel. Callum felt tears in his eyes as he watched it all unfold. The pain of losing Seren would always be part of him, but it had been transformed into something beautiful, a gateway through which others could find their way to deeper truth. "She would be proud of you," Vesper said softly, taking his hand. "Of all of us, really. Of what this place has become." "She knew," Callum replied, smiling through his tears. "Somehow she knew this was possible. That even our deepest wounds could become windows to grace." As the morning revelation concluded, the gathered crowd began to disperse, moving out into a town that had been forever changed by divine presence. The streets of Thornhaven Moor glowed with subtle light. The trees whispered with angel voices, and every person who lived there carried within them an awareness of something greater than themselves. The transformation that had begun with one man's act of despair had become a permanent testament to the reality of divine love. Callum's choice to embrace transformation rather than return to normal had opened a door that would never close, creating a place where heaven and earth would forever dance together in perfect harmony. Sister Helena approached Callum as the last of the morning crowd departed. "You know," she said with a gentle smile, "what happened here will be remembered for generations. But the real miracle isn't in the supernatural manifestations. It's in the changed hearts of everyone who experiences this place." Callum nodded, understanding at last the full significance of what had occurred. His grief had become a gift, his doubt had become a door, and his moment of deepest despair had become a fountain of eternal hope. As the sun rose fully over Thornhaven Moor, the cathedral bells rang out with a sound that carried not just across the town, but across the boundary between worlds. It was a sound of celebration, of confirmation, of eternal grace made manifest in a world hungry for wonder. And in that sound, in that light, in that moment of perfect clarity, Callum Thorne, the man who had torn a Bible in anger, finally found the peace he had been seeking all along. Not in answers, but in mystery. Not in certainty, but in faith. Not in ending, but in eternal beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.